Hello, I'm Kath Feely and I'm a historian here at the University of Derby. It's my absolute pleasure to be welcoming you to this event today. This event is part of Being Human, which is a national festival of the humanities. In fact, the only national festival of the humanities in the UK. And this is run by the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, and it's supported by the British Academy and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So before we start today, I wanted to thank them for making all of this possible. There are over 150 events happening as part of the Being Human Festival over the next 10 days. So if you'd like to know more about these events, you can go to the Being Human Festival webpage, which you can find at beinghumanfestival.org, or you can follow them on Twitter, and you can follow them at Being Human Fest. So there's lots of events going on across the country and indeed across the world for this particular festival. And because we're in the year that we're in 2020, most of these are happening online so that you can join them wherever you are in the world. The theme for this year's Being Human Festival is New Worlds, and I don't think I can think of a more appropriate theme for this year, a year when we've had to rethink how we live and how we communicate with each other, both in terms of our everyday lives, but also how we communicate our research. And so before we started today's events, I just wanted to thank particularly the partners that have been working with us at the University of Derby to put these events on. We've been working with libraries, archives and museums across the city and county, and their staff have given us their expertise, their enthusiasm and their time at a time when they have been under a huge amount of pressure. And so we really appreciate the amount of work that has gone into this from our partners. I'd also like to thank the colleagues across the university who have supported us in these events. So the academics who are taking part, but also the many support staff that actually make these events happen. And here at the University of Derby, we're also involving our students in the Being Human Festival. So we have, I hope, a number of history and English students who are in the audience, who are evaluating the festival and evaluating our events. And we also have, in the studio today, we have the live events team of students who are actually making sure that we can film these events properly and are making sure that they're streaming perfectly for you today. So I'd really like to thank them because they're doing an absolute excellent job and making sure that we're properly socially distanced in the studio and everything is working as it should be. So what we've been doing at the University of Derby, we are a hub for the Being Human Festival. So we've been organising a whole range of different events. And what we decided to do was that we were going to organise things around objects and documents that told us perhaps new stories and new perspectives around thinking about the history of Derbyshire and Derby over the last 300 years. So we particularly wanted to look at how we can connect local and regional history with global history. And we wanted to think about stories of empire, of exploitation and exploration, and think about the legacy of those for us today as a region and for how we think about our history and heritage. So we've worked with a lot of partners, as we said, to do this. And today's event, we're starting with the world, literally. We're looking at how the world was imagined in the 18th century through the maps of an extraordinary cartographer, Hermann Moll. And in a few moments' time, I'm going to pass you over to Professor Paul Elliott, from the University of Derby and Mark Young from Derby Local Studies and Family History Library, who are going to tell us a lot about this set of maps, what their significance is, what they tell us about the 18th century and ideas about the world in the 18th century. But they're also going to tell us a little bit about their theories around how and why these maps may have ended up in the Derby Local Studies collection. But there is a mystery at the heart of today's event, and it's one that we'd like you to help with. So at the end of this event, we're going to set you a challenge. We're opening a flash fiction competition, which is about telling the story of the journey of these maps to Derby in 50 words or less. So if you want to get your thinking caps on and your writing hands ready, you can also try and workshop some of these ideas as we go through today's event. If you'd like to tweet your sort of works in progress, please do so. We've got a hashtag that we'd like you to use, which is just hashtag #MollMaps. And if you add that to your tweet, we can bring it up on the screen and share those as we go along. I'll be coming back later in the event to talk about how that competition is going to work. Please do tweet as we go on, but for now I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of Paul Elliott and Mark Young to actually tell us the story of these maps.
Caught your attention in the first place?
Well, I think, Paul, first of all, for me, if I'm really honest about this, the thing that grabbed my attention is that sense of romance about these maps. It came up in this first image that we can see on the screen. Moll's got these blank areas on the map, and it simply says, parts unknown. And we're one step away here from monsters be here. And it transported me almost instantly to Pirates on the High Seas and the Spanish Armada and treasure maps. And that sense of the world not being fully explored and them just not really understanding some of what was out there hasn't really left me. The more I've looked at these maps, over and over again, it just keeps coming through, that sense of sort of romance and Pirates on the High Seas, like I said. So I think that's always driven my interest in these maps, let's say. And with my librarian's hat on, one of the first things that I noticed about these maps was, well, what are they doing in the local studies collection? And that's at the top of this event, really, and the competition that will follow. Yeah. Why have we got a set of world maps in a local studies library? Everything in the local studies collection has some relation to Derby or Derbyshire. It might not be immediately obvious, but there's always something there. Either it's a local author or it's a local subject. And even if it's a general work, there will be some example that leads you back to Derby within the work or something like that. And we came across these maps in the collection. We looked a little bit at Moll. There's no immediate connection that Moll has to Derby or Derbyshire, and they're maps of the world, so they're not telling us anything particular about Derby that isn't elsewhere. So there seems to be something of a cuckoo in our nest, if you like. They don't seem to belong at the surface level. I don't believe that's actually the case. Hopefully we can come back to this later on in the event, but I think there probably is a connection here and that we're just missing some information. I I think the other thing that really captivates me about these maps is that they're just multi-layered. Every time you go back to, and it's often the case with historic maps, every time you look at them, you come across something new. You see something different, and the documents speak to you. And in this case, I think one of the things that comes through from these maps is Moll himself. And there are these little asides all the way across the documents. He's telling you that you should believe his mapping because he's got the most accurate information, he's got the most up-to-date information, his charts are the most accurate, you shouldn't believe his competitors. And then there are these little comments running all the way through the maps where I've drawn these islands here, but the Spaniards say they don't exist. And Moll's voice comes through really quite clearly, I think, in these maps. And yet, paradoxically, we don't actually know a great deal about Herman Moll himself. And I think you can tell us the little bit that we do know, Paul.
Yes, so I'll just say a little bit more about Herman Moll and his context. I mean, one of the things to say straight away, really, is, and it is a striking fact, he's Dutch-German, so we know he's got those connections, closely connected with the continent, and of course, the fact that he's Dutch, or we think probably either entirely or partly Dutch, is significant because, of course, in the late 17th century and the early 18th century, when Moll's career flourished, that was when the Netherlands, the Dutch, that was one of the great international trading empires. So the Dutch had bases all over the world. They were an incredibly urbanized society and a very kind of wealthy society as well, important sort of consumer culture, innovations in art and so on. So I think that's significant. Also, the Dutch were very attuned to developments, wider developments of the 17th century in terms of what we sometimes call the scientific revolution. So major developments in astronomy and the mathematical sciences in particular. Herman Moll, though, didn't stay on the continent, didn't stay in the Netherlands, although he kept up those connections with Germany and Holland. He went to London, which was becoming the great sort of political centre of the world at this time in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And Moll made a living as a cartographer, so he created maps, geographical works, published things like atlases as well as maps, and other things that were related to that, such as globes. Also, the circle he moved in is striking in that respect as well. He was connected with members of the Royal Society of London, and this is a very crucial time for the development of the Royal Society in the late 17th century. In the wake of the civil wars and the restoration of the monarchy in the 1660s, one of the first things that the government of Charles II did was to create the Royal Society, which was based in London, but had fellows throughout the British Isles and further afield. And like continental scientific societies, the Royal Society gave lectures, members gave lectures, but they also had publications. They produced transactions in which there were papers about things like scientific, mathematical questions, astronomical, but also, and this is where the connection with Moll is very interesting, geographical matters as well. So there were, one of their great concerns, for example, in the late 17th and 18th century, was finding a solution to the problem of longitude, a great question which was a real sort of a limiting force to international navigation. And ships had foundered on the rocks because of difficulties working out their exact positions, but particularly in bad weather when it was difficult to make out things like stars and planets and so on to use as a means of navigation. So Moll is connected to the Royal Society, and of course its members included Sir Isaac Newton, the president of the society, but also people like Robert Boyle, who pioneered the sort of modern idea of scientific experimentation, using apparatus like the air pump and so forth. So you could conduct experiments, but also make predictions about the natural world and what was going to happen in the future. And Christopher Wren, who we all know as an astronomer, he was another key figure, but we all know him as an architect, of course, at St. Paul's and London's churches after the fire, but he was also professor of mathematics and astronomy. Another of Moll's friends was the antiquarian William Stukeley, who toured the country making drawings of places like stone circles and burial chambers, which he believed were druidical temples. So Moll's connected with this, very closely connected with this scientific and geographical milieu. One final thing I'll say just before passing over to Mark again is that, of course, this is in many ways the age of exploration from a European perspective. So we have, during the 15th and 16th centuries, famously, the Spanish, the Portuguese originally, under the authority of the Pope, dividing up the entire globe and sailing around across the Atlantic and the oceans of the world, trying to establish colonies and, of course, conquering peoples in South America. The conquistadors were wreaking havoc wherever they went. So it was very kind of oppressive as well. The Spanish were interested in what things like precious metals, wealth, and resources they could obtain from their colonies. Later on, in the 17th century, the Dutch, the French, and other powers come in and also start to establish their maritime prominence through trade, but also through warfare. And particularly after the civil wars in the later 17th century, this is the period when England really starts to establish itself. There's a great war with France under the Sun King Louis XIV, which England emerges in the end triumphant, and that is really the start of England's kind of sort of move towards global domination during the 18th and early 19th centuries. What I'd like to do then is focus a little bit more on some elements of Moll's maps. So I'm just going to ask Mark, what sort of features really stand out, or perhaps for you or in general, about the maps?
Well, I think, Paul, some of the things that you've just been talking about actually are very prominent on these maps. You can see the interest that Moll appears to be talking to an audience who are interested in things like territorial claims, extensive territories, trade, resources in some of these countries. So you've got things like diamond mines marked in South America, good fishing grounds, trade winds, all these sorts of things that might be useful to a country intent on conquest and colonialism might find useful. So there's a definite emphasis on those sorts of concerns happening on these maps. One of the other things that's striking, I think, and it comes back to the point I was making earlier, Moll is making these claims about being accurate and having the most up-to-date information, and yet to modernise, there are all sorts of inaccuracies and assumptions being made on these maps that just are incorrect, to put it bluntly. So, for example, you've got the California Peninsula that runs down the west coast of Mexico, depicted as an island. It's a completely separate island, and that was a common assumption at the time. There's a block of islands, I think it's the Philippines or Indonesia possibly, that are shown almost as a square cluster of islands, And my geography is awful. But even without knowing exactly what they should look like, to modernise, you can look at these depictions and just see that that isn't how it should be.
Yeah.
So he's got these sort of loose impressions of things rather than accuracy geographically. And then there are things that are just missing. So you've got the parts unknown, but also things like the coast of Australia is shown partially. You've got a sketchy outline of the north coast of Australia. Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, is kind of adjoined onto it, but there's no sense of it being an entire continent at all. All that information just hasn't yet been discovered. So yeah. you get this real sense that it's a work in progress and that the world is still under exploration from a European perspective. And I think that comes through very clearly in these maps, and it really takes you to that moment in time. It's a real window into the European mindset at that particular time in history. You can see some of these maps on screen now. These are the actual scans of the actual maps in the library, and you can see that they've been around the block. They've suffered water damage in the past. Where they've been folded, the paper is damaged and worn. So some sections have come away and been repaired with tissue repairs at a later date. Some sections are actually entirely missing. But they're still an impressive document, I think. And this isn't just a map of the world. This is 22 really big sheets. Moll was printing on what was known as double elephant sized paper, which is, I think, the second largest size of paper that was available to an 18th century printer, and really no expenses spared. So if we had a full set, there would be 30 sheets, all showing different countries. Some countries are depicted more than once, and I think that's one of the other things that stands out here is the attention that goes into America. America is obviously contested at this time. So you get one sheet that shows English territories in America and one sheet that shows French territories in North America. And then there's a sheet for South America. And then interestingly, we have this sheet that's on the screen at the moment that shows the extent of the territory under the control of the South Sea Company. And Paul, I think you can tell us a little bit more about the South Sea Company.
Yes. So the sort of commercial impetus for the production of Moll's maps came from the development of broadly of England stroke Britain, because of course in the 18th century England becomes Britain in a sense with, we have the union of crowns and then the union of parliaments during the 18th century between England and Scotland. So Britain's, the English stroke British sort of commercial drive to sort of carve out a big space in international trade, that's what the maps are closely related to, that kind of impetus. And certainly that explains some of the content of the maps, and also, I think, who would have bought them. We'll come back to this question later on, but certainly what we need to think is that these would probably have not been bought by sailors, they would not have been taken on ships, they would not really have been used for navigation. They're not navigational charts per se, though they do include information from ships' navigational charts, and also information from things like the papers of scientific societies like the Royal Society. So that information is in there, but alongside a lot of other sources as well. And it's also worth bearing in mind that there was a lot of what we would regard as plagiarism in the late 17th and 18th century, particularly in the world of cartography and publishing. And with Moll's map, it was even kind of double plagiarized. So some of Moll's maps were plagiarized on the continent, and he then recopied those versions of his original maps back again. And this was quite common practice at the time because the copyright laws really were a lot looser and weren't quite what we would understand by that. So there's this commercial imperative and that's really kind of encoded on the maps. And one side of that is the role of trading companies. So London, right at the end of the 17th century and in the first decades of the 18th century, London's becoming really, certainly the commercial hub of Europe in many ways, but also of the world. You have the Exchange, where there's a wonderful essay by the writer Joseph Addison in The Spectator magazine from exactly this time, where he talks about the wonders of the Exchange and the fact that you get the impression he would just go just to observe people from all over the world. Mahometans, people from Muscovy or Russia, people from the Indies, all coming together with Europeans to discuss trade and to talk about investment. So it's a really kind of exciting, buzzing place, and you really get a sense of that from Addison's essay. And this is very much the world of Moll's map, in which Moll's map was created. So I do think the kind of information in Moll's map would have been useful to traders and also to investors and potential investors in various international business ventures. And one of the sort of models for trade that had allowed it to develop on a global scale was that of the company. And this was originally where people would band together, merchants would band together to share the risk on international business ventures. And some of the early examples were established in England during the reign of Elizabeth. So right at the end, for example, we have the Muscovy Company, which conducted trade with what we now call Russia in things like skins, furs, wood, timber, and so forth. So there were companies like that. And of course, if you're sending ships around the world to do trade, and in some cases you're trading with powers that have not necessarily hitherto had a lot of contact with England, there's an element of risk. You don't quite know what you're going to get. And also, of course, when you're crossing the globe, you're very much at the mercy of things like currents, changing weather conditions, and so on. So it's a risky venture, and if you combine together and do that together, you share the investment in expensive things like a ship, which is typically going to be armed, then if you lose one or two ships, it's not the end of the world. You can move on to the next one potentially. Whereas if you're just on your own as a merchant, taking that risk on your own, it's too much. So the company model of sharing risk allowed English trade and trade of the other European powers to really develop. The South Sea Company is striking for us because one of the Moll maps, one of what would originally have been a collection of 30, is specifically devoted to the territory of the South Sea Company in South and Central America. And there's a little kind of cartouche on that map which gives the full name of the company and explains some of its interests. And Moll would have been appealing to patrons of that company and would have hoped that people like that and people connected with these companies would have been exactly the sort of individuals to purchase the map. The South Sea Company is also striking because it was a very successful venture and a lot of people invested in it, including people at the top of the political tree in England, well-off folk, even members of the royal family. And one of the things they got wealthy with was by getting originally the monopoly of the Spanish slave trade. So they started to bring slaves across from Africa to South America to the Spanish colonies. And because they had that monopoly and the trade grew, so in the end thousands and thousands of Africans were taken across. And of course, as we know too well, it was a brutal trade and many people died en route and so on. And then they were faced with sort of arduous labour if they did actually make it to South America. So people that invested in the South Sea Company were, in a way, had their sort of fingers dipped in blood. Some of that money was coming to from those sources. And you could say they kind of got their just comeuppance to an extent, because something called the South Sea Bubble Crisis happened in 1720, and there was a massive run on the stocks of the South Sea Company, and a lot of the prominent investors lost a major amount of money, and some people committed suicide. Nonetheless, even though that was one of the worst kind of financial crises in English banking history, even so, the company carried on, and they kept this monopoly till around the middle of the 18th century, and then gradually diversified and moved into other things. But nonetheless, the South Sea Company is a good example of the sort of context of Moll's map, why it was done and why it was depicted, why it depicted particular features rather. And that's why, for example, you see things like information about the movement of currents, about the size and usefulness of harbours, whether they can take particular vessels, which were the best ports in South and Central America, and other information like that. What were some of the rivers and inland towns, cities and settlements that they would have been dealing with? So all that information is in there. Now I'm just going to ask Mark, I mean, one of the things we want to move on to consider, we've said a lot about the features of the map, the content of it, and there's a lot more we could say. You know, each one of these maps, they're massive, as Mark said, but they have so much information crammed onto them. You could almost write an entire book about each one. There's little cartouches with engravings of towns and cities around the world. There's wonderful engravings of things, like, in some cases, animals. There's a famous beaver map in the collection which depicts beavers. There's also another engraving as well which shows the burial practices of people in northern Scandinavia. So there's all sorts of incredible information there, as well as a whole range of other things in the maps. So one intriguing question, though, that was referred to at the beginning, is how did this map, that you could understand why it would be in London, for instance, where the exchange was, where there was a large concentration of merchants and wealthy kind of elite individuals. But Derbyshire, really, in the 18th century, particularly the early 18th century, was seen as a relatively sort of wild, faraway provincial county. So there is a very, very intriguing question as to why these wonderful maps have ended up here in Derby where they are. So I wonder whether you have any views about that, Mark.
Well, I think Paul, it's twofold for me. I mean, there's the question about why are they in Derby and Derbyshire, but also why particularly are they in the local studies collection where they appear to have no place. So without digressing too deeply into a history of libraries in Derby, which I could probably talk about all night, I'll start with what we do know. You saw at the start of the presentation a catalogue card on screen, and that is the catalogue card for the maps in this collection. Alongside that card, the information that we have is that these maps are formally entered into the library collection in 1926, which might lead you to believe that around that time is when the libraries acquire them, which isn't actually the case. What we know is that around this time there was a big drive to modernise the library, and a lot of cataloguing work started at this time, so existing collections were being reorganised. Going back a little bit further, public libraries in Derby begin in 1871. The Public Library Act was passed in 1850. Derby didn't take up on it until 20 odd years later. And the Derby Free Library starts in 1871. They didn't start with a clean sheet. They acquire an existing private subscription library and museum, the Town and County Museum, and that forms the basis of what today is Derby Libraries and Derby Museums. So there would have been some collections that came along with that, but primarily they were interested in creating a lending library service and a reference library. So there may have been some local interest material. There may have been, this set of maps may have been amongst them. So that's one possibility of how it entered the library, and that's the earliest time that these maps would have come into public possession. Moving forward a little way, in 1878, the Duke of Devonshire, the 7th Duke of Devonshire, makes a donation of a collection of what's described as Derby or Derbyshire books and pamphlets. That collection had been compiled by a local antiquarian, Llewellyn Jewett, and then the Duke makes the donation of it to the borough. This was met with great celebration at the time. There's a big article in the paper. The town stopped for the afternoon. They all went for a banquet. Speeches were made, toasts were made, and sort of commitment to making Derby Free Library have a specialty of gathering local material was also made. But then it all goes quiet. And although the new building opens the following year, there's nothing really in the records then that show that commitment was built on. So the Duke of Devonshire collection is another candidate for these maps arriving into the local studies, the modern local studies collection in 1878. In the intervening years, that donation may have inspired other smaller private donations that don't make the news. We don't have records or complete records of any of this early activity. So this is all really in the realms of speculation now. Then in 1911, a chap called Sir Henry Howe Bemrose dies, and he is from a very successful family of printers in the town. In fact, Bemrose only went out of business, I think, finally in about 2010. They've been a big Derby employer for a long time. Bemrose had a huge interest in gathering local material, particularly an interest in local authors, it seems, and he'd amassed a substantial private library. No expense seems to have been spared in his collecting habits. He employed a librarian and he employed a historian to manage this collection. And there's a definite sense that I've picked up from looking at Bemrose that either he or his employees really knew what they were looking for. They understood the significance of what would sometimes appear to be fairly random local documentation, and they acquire it voraciously. So Henry Howe Bemrose dies, and that collection ends up being bought by public subscription and becoming part of the library. And the Bemrose collection and the Devonshire collection together form the hub of the modern local studies collections. So we've got three distinct possibilities there for these maps arriving into public possession. But even if we go for the earliest of those, 1871, when the library is founded, these maps are already 150 years old at that point. So we've got this great big gap in their history, particularly from the point in 1926 when this catalogue card appears, which is the only definite information that we really have. So that's almost 200-year gap from these maps being printed in London for sale in Moll's shop to arriving in the local studies collection in 1926. So that's a long time that we need to account for. If it was part of the town and county library and museum, that institution existed for some years prior to being taken over. I'm not sure of its exact history, but it would take us back at least some way further. But then I think it's interesting. What we really need to think about is who would originally have bought these maps back in the day, back in 1720 to 1740-ish. First of all, who would have had the financial means, because paper wasn't cheap back then. As we've said, there's a lot of paper involved here. never mind the work that Moll's put into making the maps. So they wouldn't have been cheap to purchase. And who would have had the motivation to buy them? And what would that motivation have been? And particularly, why have they come to Derby? And as Paul said, on the face of it, Derby is a provincial town. We're out in the sticks. However, in the 18th century, particularly the later 18th century, Derby was becoming a thriving hub of intellectual activity, a lot more so than you might give it credit for. We can see some images on the screen now of how Derby might have looked in the 17th century, 18th century and early 19th century. It's a small, compact town, and particularly in these engravings, its rural aspect is being emphasised. As soon as you leave the immediate city centre, you're out essentially into countryside. However, alongside that, you've got the silk mill is established around 1724, the world's first factory, and from that point forward, we're at really the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1700s, but from that point onwards, Derby is steadily industrialised. And alongside that industrialisation, you have more progressive thinkers, intellectuals and things who are partly driving the Industrial Revolution and partly the Industrial Revolution is driving them. Paul, I think you can tell us a little bit more about the intellectual society in Derby at that time. And also, I think one of the other possibilities here is the educational value that these maps might have held. So a distinct possibility here, as well as being part of a library or museum collection, is that they may have been part of an educational establishment's library. So there are a few distinct possibilities there, aren't there, in Derby?
Yes, there are. And I think, as Mark was saying, whilst perhaps from a sort of London perspective, you might think that in the 18th century there's not a lot happening in the provinces. Actually, of course, there's a massive amount going on. And although there was a bit of tension in the 18th century, as there is today, really, between metropolis and province, and people from London might look down a little bit on their sort of provincial cousins, whereas people from the provinces might look up to London, and certainly did, but also with some jealousy and using London fashion, London culture as a bit of a yardstick to judge their own culture. But some of the kind of interesting intellectual currents in the provinces at the time that Mark was talking about in the 18th century might provide a clue for this sort of tantalising historical detective mystery about where the map actually originates from. Does it come in the 19th century, the 20th century, or the 18th century to Derby? If it does come around the time it's published in the 18th century, which in some ways does make sense, then one of my theories, and it is only a theory, is that it may be connected with something called the Findon and Derby Dissenting Academy. Now, in the context of the restoration of the monarchy from the 1660s that I mentioned at the beginning, one of the results of that was that dissenters were gradually kind of ejected from their livings in the Anglican Church. So you have dissenting congregations, people like Presbyterians and Baptists, who had somewhat different beliefs from mainstream Anglicanism, losing access to the kind of formal parish structures. So what you find in the 1660s, 70s and 80s onwards is that these dissenting congregations have to establish their own chapels and meeting houses. They're not allowed to create a church because they're not, they're disobeying the rules of the Anglican Church. Of course, it's worth keeping in mind that no one knows that they're going to remain outside the Anglican Church at this point. Nobody knows the future, and for all they knew, they might return to the fold a short while after. But one of the a thriving congregation, a Presbyterian congregation, was established in Derby in the late 17th century. And by the 1690s, they'd built a chapel on Friargate. They'd also established an academy or school under somebody called Ebenezer Latham. And this was although it was quite a small institution, even domestic, which was based for a time in Derby, but more of the time at a small village to the south of Derby called Findon. It was mainly designed to teach ministers, future ministers for the denomination, for the Presbyterians, but they did teach others as well. One of the things that dissenting schools and colleges were particularly known for in the late 17th and 18th century was the fact that they kind of embraced the teaching of the sciences and subjects like geography, what were described then as modern subjects. They were more willing to embrace them than some of the grammar schools that were around at the time, whose education was still much more closely based upon the teaching of Latin in particular and Bible studies. So they tended to embrace, in some cases, the dissenting academies, a somewhat larger curriculum. And we know from the case of the Findon Academy that included geography. Now, we know geography was taught there because we have Ebenezer Latham's manuscript notebook, which gives some account of lectures. We also have other surviving materials which seem to have been acquired by the Derby collection. And my theory is that the Moll map may have been acquired with these other materials associated with the Findon Academy. The other clue that might have happened is that one of the works that was directly produced for the Academy was something called a Manual of Modern Geography, written by a minister and one of the tutors at the Academy, somebody called John Gregory. And this was first published, the first edition of that is in the 1730s. I think it's 1739. And I think that's almost exactly the time when the Moll maps would have been acquired by them or by somebody. And we know that because there are references to George II in the Moll maps. So it's clearly dates from after 1727, it must do, in terms of when it was acquired. And the interesting thing about Gregory's Manual of Modern Geography is, as he says in his preface, it's a geographical textbook, a kind of primer with things like lists of information about particular countries, brief summaries of what the peoples of those countries were, the climate and so forth, what the trade and industry, the products were. And it was designed to help teach geography. But it only works, as Gregory makes very clear in his preface, with a map. So to keep the price down, he doesn't have any engravings in it at all. So it's cheap enough for schools to acquire, but they would have also needed to acquire a set of maps. Now, although Moll's maps would have been expensive, there were quite a few wealthy benefactors of dissenting congregations. So that is a possibility that someone could have donated it or helped pay for it for the Findon Academy. The other thing we know in the 18th century was that there was a lot of innovation and interest in geographical teaching. So really for the first time, things like what were called the globes were being taught in many schools and academies. And maps would have been held up and put onto the wall during the teaching process, and places would have been referred to. The other reason why the Moll map is interesting in that respect is that some of the maps within the collection, as it stands at Derby, have purely educational purposes. So they're not current knowledge. There's a map of the Roman Empire, for example. And that's clearly about education. It's part of a classical education. Roman sort of geography, the geography of Greece and Rome, and sort of biblical lands would have been taught. We know that. Also, there's there are astronomical maps and diagrams, what were called celestial maps within the Moll collection as well. So that kind of astronomical information was not original. This is not the stuff that would have been directly interested in people like, people like merchants and so on would have been directly interested in, but it is something that would have been taught in geographical lessons in something like a dissenting academy. One of the things they did was they asked their students to work out the coordinates of particular locations and also get to know really the position of the planets and how the planets move around in the solar system. And of course, this is very much the Newtonian solar system. This is this idea that the solar system as we understand it, and as Joseph Wright of Derby's painting shows very well, this is the kind of, one of the greatest achievements of Newtonian science, and this demonstration of these supreme, sublime powers of gravity operating in the solar system. So all this would have been part of the education in a dissenting academy like that of Findon. So that is one possibility. There are other possibilities, though, as Mark was saying, and I think plenty of opportunity for people to think about those and the evidence for some of the other ideas and suggestions. So, Mark, I wonder if you wanted to say a bit more about the competition element here.
You kind of touched on a few of those possibilities. The Findon Academy is attached to the Unitarian Chapel in Friargate, and there were a number of high-profile Derbyans who attended that chapel. People like William Strutt, who would have had the means to have bought a set of maps like this, and is a known benefactor of the town. There are a whole range of people, but also other societies, as well as the various schools that were existing in Derby, of which perhaps the Findon Academy is the most likely. We've got things like the Derby Philosophical Society happening, which Paul can tell you all about all night, I'm sure.
Not now.
But there's the Literary and Philosophical Society, and there are various other institutions that crop up further down the timeline. So things like the Derby Mechanics Institute, for example. So there are all kinds of contenders for where these maps may have been, whether it was in an individual's collection, whether it was a status symbol for an aristocrat, or something used in a classroom. There are all kinds of interesting possibilities, but it certainly isn't beyond the bounds of possibility that these were in Derby from the outset, and have changed hands a few times perhaps in the meantime, and ended up in our library. I think to perhaps to finish, the one thing that I am convinced of is that although there isn't an immediately obvious local connection, the librarian in 1926 who decided to add this to the local studies collection must have had some information that made a clear link for them between these maps and Derby. And I think it's now over to the realms of fiction to make that link real again, because we're just missing that information. We've prepared a handout to go with this session, which gives you some of these possibilities that we've outlined and some of the information that we've touched on about the maps. So I think this is probably a good time now to hand back to Kath, who's going to talk to you about the competition, the flash fiction writing competition. Kath, do you want to?
Well, thank you for a really fascinating insight, not only to the maps, but also to the 18th century and 19th century history of Derby. We've gone from the solar system to Derby. We've seen beavers and bubbles along the way. There's a lot there in the maps themselves for the imagination to help you perhaps think about the journey that they may have taken. And these maps have been digitised now. You can go to the Derby Library's website and their portal, Our History, you can go and actually look at these yourself. So if you want some inspiration for your stories, you can go there. What we're setting you as a competition, you should, as Mark has said, have got a couple of handouts on this emailed to you as you registered for today's event. What we're setting is a competition where we're asking you to write your own story about this in 50 words or less. There are only sort of 3 things that I think you need to think about if you are writing this kind of story, what we call flash fiction, this very short piece of writing. And that's, we've given you so much historical context, and you've got to really sort of pare it down. So there's a couple of key tips that I'd like to give you. First is keep it simple. You can't have all of these things in your story. You can't have all of the images that we've talked about today, and you can't have lots of different characters. So what I'd suggest in your 50 words is that you pare down, have a good single image, a single story that tells us something quite deep in a quite short space. Perhaps think about it as this catalogue card that you have on the screen. You're adding to that provenance information. So you need to sort of pare things down. So keep it simple. The other thing that we suggest is that you keep it moving. This is a story that's about a journey. So make sure that all of your words are quite active and that there is a genuine journey within it, that we see sort of movement in your 50 words. And the other thing is we would like it to be properly related to Derby because this is about provenance, it's about trying to explain how these maps have got here. So those are the only sort of 3 rules really to this competition. I've put all the information on the handout that you should have got, and it's you will email your entries by the 4th of December. So you should have all the information there to start writing. And I hope that you can carry on this incredible story. And the prize for this competition is that the top 3, it will be judged by a panel from the Department of Humanities at the University of Derby and also Derby Libraries. The top 3 entrants will be guaranteed publication on our website. We're launching a new public humanities website, and you will be the sort of first things on it. And also a selection of the entries will be published in an anthology that will go alongside these maps and be part of the our Derby's History portal. So it will be there with the maps, hopefully for all time, so that you become part of the history of these maps yourself. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank again Mark Young from the Derby Local Studies and Family History Library and Professor Paul Elliott from the University of Derby for giving us a really good insight into these maps and hopefully giving you some inspiration to go off and tell your own stories about it. Before we go, I would just like to point to the fact that this is the first event of a whole series of events for the University of Derby's Hub for Being Human. If you Google Derby Being Human, you can get the university website that has all of the upcoming events. If you're a fan of maps, for example, on Monday the 16th, we have an event with the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site, thinking about maps of the local area. So we've had the world and the solar system, now we've got the Derwent Valley. So if you want to have a look at that, and we're going to be talking to Adrian Farmer, who's an expert in these maps, and we're also going to be making our own maps of the area, our own memory maps, so that we can add to the collection of Derbyshire Record Office on that. We've also got an event on Tuesday the 17th about landscapes of lime burning, which is really interesting in thinking about the imagination and particularly the poetic imagination and how that related to Derbyshire's industrial and natural landscape. And we've also got on Saturday, the 21st of November, we have the Museum of Me, which is about objects that came from across the world and found themselves in Derbyshire Record Office. So we've got a whole host of events for you. I hope you enjoy them, and I hope you've enjoyed tonight. And please do at least go away with a little bit of inspiration and add to the history of these maps for us. Thank you very much indeed.